Okay, here we go. All right, so we're kickstarting this spring section session of Landscapes Live 2025. So welcome everybody. I see a full room. We have about 70 participants, give or take now. And we're really excited today to start to kick off this session with Professor Paul Bierman. So before I introduce Paul, I'll just make some announcements. If you haven't seen our schedule for our sequence of talks, go ahead and take a look at our website. Some of the talks are there. The list of talks are there, and I will also let you know that we're still looking for candidates to join our organizing team. So please keep those emails coming if you're interested in participating in running the show here with Landscapes Live. Okay, so again, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Bierman. Paul is a geologist and runs the cosmogenic let me try not to get this name of the lab wrong here. The Community Cosmogenic Nuclide Facility at the University of Vermont this is one of the leading laboratories for cosmogenic nuclide data production. Professor Paul Bierman works with the dynamic of the Earth's surface and the interactions with humans, and works in both glacial and tropical landscapes. And currently, today, we'll be talking about the new discoveries in the Greenland ice sheet. So, Paul, welcome. It's our pleasure to host you today, and the floor is yours. Take it away.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Let's see if I can get the slides to go up and share properly. We'll go from there. All right. Are you seeing my projection screen?
Yep.
All right.
Coming through.
Good. Okay. Well, thanks. So I want to talk today in a new way. Part of this talk I've done before, and a big part of it I haven't. And so I'm really hoping for feedback from everybody. It's a first attempt at trying to put together about 5 years worth of work that we've done on 3.44 meters of sediment from underneath the Greenland ice sheet. So I've entitled this A Landscape Under the Ice because I'm trying to move from a number of the geochemical observations we've made to a more holistic view of what 5-inch wide core that's, almost 3.5 meters long can tell us about Greenland and Greenland in the past. All right, so more than 80% of Greenland landscape is covered by ice, and that makes it a really tough place for geomorphologists to understand most of the island. As you can see, this is a flow model of the ice sheet. The areas around the edges are ice-free, but everything else is buried under up to 2 miles of ice at the center. And we do have some idea of the history of the ice sheet. This is a diagram that we put together, a team of us put together now 9 years ago for a paper in Science about the history of the ice sheet. And everything in blue suggests that the ice sheet was large and expanded, and everything in red suggests that it went away. And if you look to the bottom, this is the Pleistocene, there's the Pliocene and the Miocene. And the indications are that Greenland got its first major ice sheet sometime in the Pliocene, and then it expanded during the Pleistocene. And the big outstanding questions are how much of the Pleistocene in Greenland was ice covered and how much of the island was ice covered. And the data in 2016 were pretty ambiguous. They remain ambiguous, but I think we're starting to get a much better handle on that. And I'll just give you my implicit bias right up front is that I believe the ice was on much more than it was off, but there were times in the Pleistocene when the ice was gone from Greenland. And we'll come back to that and the data behind my thinking. So today, if you were to instantaneously vanish the ice sheet so that we all as geomorphologists could look at the landscape, we'd find that much of the island is below sea level. And this paper really laid that out beautifully, based on ice bridge radar lines through the ice, which give us not only the internal ice stratigraphy, but give us the bed and allow for incredible animations that many of you have probably seen like this that show the ice, infer the age of the ice, and then infer the landscape beneath. And if you look at their compilation maps, again, this is an instantaneous removal of the ice, so we're not thinking about isostatic rebound, Greenland would actually be an archipelago with highlands around the edges, and then the center of it is below sea level, and through the northwest here is actually connected. So you'd have a shallow ocean in the center of the Greenland ice sheet and highlands around the sides. We're going to focus today on Camp Century, and hopefully people can see where my pointer is up here. It's on an upland in northwestern Greenland, so it was not marine even with the ice depressing that part of the world. All right, so that leaves us as geomorphologists to look around the edges, where indeed there are a variety of landscapes. And again, just the index map here to show you where Camp Century is. It happens to be rather close to a local ice divide there. And I'll explain a little bit about that when we get to the building of the camp, that was a happy accident due to the engineers involved. So certainly a lot of Greenland is glacially eroded rock, and that implies warm-based ice, at least sometime in the past, to do that polishing and streamlining of those features. And so we have that barren rock landscape. We also have a weathered rock plus erratics landscape in many parts of Greenland. This is the result of having cold-based ice that preserves the weathered regolith below, but then when it melts away, leaves these erratics. And they're often found by using cosmogenic nuclide analysis, and the weathered rock tends to give depressed aluminum-26 beryllium-10 ratios because it's been covered by ice. Lee Corbett, who manages our lab, refers to these as ghost glaciers. And then you date the erratics and you find out that many of the erratics are actually LGM in age, whereas the rock beneath can give effective ages of hundreds of thousands of years. And that implies a non-erosive regime for the ice. There are plenty of depositional landforms surrounding the islands out at the edge, glacial deltas, for instance. This is one in Kangerlussuaq that we were sampling to try to understand what the concentrations of beryllium-10 and aluminum-26 were as the ice was retreating. And then there's certainly depositional landforms related to the fjords and the estuaries there. So looking at the landscapes today, you see a wide variety of different types of depositional environments and different landforms that resulted from them. But again, we're only seeing the edges. We're not seeing underneath. And what we do see underneath is that very mega scale view that the ice bridge radar provides us. Of course, we can go offshore and try to learn something about the Greenland landscape in an amalgamated fashion by looking at marine cores. And that gives us a big picture, but it can be an occasionally blurry picture. And these are some of the cores. This is a Canamus core from northeast Greenland that we've been working on that goes back into the Miocene and has indications of glaciation. And this is the paper that really kicked off the whole of this. This is Larson's paper in Science. And this is their stratigraphic diagram with some age control. And the Ds represent dropstones. And so from the dropstones, which extend down to a depth of a little over 500 meters in their core here, they could suggest that the glaciation in Greenland began about 7 million years ago, because when they first started seeing dropstones. But the question is, where were those glaciers and how big were they? Were they just coastal glaciers in East Greenland? The coring site is in East Greenland, or was this a fully extended ice sheet? So if we're trying to infer these past landscapes, the marine record gives us, again, hints, but it doesn't give us anything local. So Jeremy Schocken, who's been working with our community facility for years, has, along with several of his students, processed a series of IODP and ODP cores around Greenland. And we now, I can say we sort of have the island surrounded between us all. These are the results from these 4 cores that we have here. The Canamus core is up to the northeast, and we have the beryllium but not the aluminum, so I didn't include it here at this point. But this tells us something about the behavior of the ice over longer time frames, and these are the data that Jeremy has. And we can step through these and first look at the beryllium-10 concentrations, and these are corrected for decay, knowing the age of the sediments, and the scale takes us from today back to 9 million years ago. And in general, with the cores that go back further, we see a lowering in the beryllium-10 concentration. And that's consistent with an ice sheet eroding regolith from a pre-glacial time in Greenland. And then we get down to today, and all of the cores have very low concentrations of beryllium-10. again, consistent with a landscape that's been covered by ice for most of the Pleistocene. More interesting in many ways is the aluminum-26 beryllium-10 ratio because the aluminum-26 has a shorter half-life. And so when it's buried by ice, that ratio will decrease after initial exposure. And what we see, and the cores are all color coded here. So the green is in Baffin Bay here, the red is South Greenland, 918 is the Larsen core in East Greenland, and 987 is near Scoresby Sund here in East Greenland, and that's in blue. What we see is that the production ratio is here just over 7, and that all of the cores except 918 spend almost all of their time with a depressed aluminum-26 beryllium-10 ratio. And that implies extensive and long-lasting ice cover to do that. Because if the ice were off, that ratio would rather rapidly, over thousands to a few tens of thousands of years, climb back to the production ratio. And it doesn't. So these data suggest to us that the landscape in Greenland as a whole throughout the last several million years, and we can argue how many several means, has been largely ice covered and not continuously exposed. Jeremy will push that back as far as even 5 million years now with those ratios for significant ice cover, at least on parts of the landscape that are feeding this marine record. So we go into this. I said I'd explain my bias. My bias is that the landscapes in Greenland have been covered by ice for most of the Pleistocene and through into the Pliocene. All right, so let's now zoom into ice cores, which offer us a very different view on the landscape. They don't integrate anything. They give us at the base of those ice cores a 5 or 6 or even a 1 inch core of the landscape below where you're drilling. And so far, there are 2 deep ice cores in Greenland that have gotten to the bottom and brought some up. One is Camp Century, which we'll spend almost all of the talk on today. The other is GISP 2, which is in the center of Greenland. There are cores through shallower ice now, from Jason Briner and Jörg Schaefer along the northern stretch of Greenland, for which there really has not been much data published yet. They just got those samples. This is the drill rig at Camp Century. Sometime between 1961 and 1966, my guess is it's much closer to 61. There's no frost on the walls. They still have daylight over the top of the drilling tower here. So this is probably early on in their drilling. This core was drilled by the US military. I find that more than ironic these days that the first ice core that was used to determine paleoclimate and is so critical in understanding what humans have done to climate was drilled by one of the more conservative organizations in our country. And I think that's a wonderful irony and, in fact, a way to bridge some of the red-blue divide in the United States right now. In 1966, after 6 years of drilling, they made it to the bottom. They recovered 3.44 meters of sub-ice material. That material was in Krell and in the university at Buffalo until 1994. Then did not move to the US Ice Core facility in Denver, was at least to American scientists lost, and then it was refound in Copenhagen in 2018 and had been stored and perfectly preserved since then. Very little science was done on the sub-ice material. A lot of science was done on the ice core, but I'm not going to talk about the ice core. I'm going to talk about the sub-ice material. The cores were taken off the ice on these funny looking, I don't call them sleds, wagons with 10-foot high wheels pulled by tractors. You can see the cores in metal coated cardboard tubes here. And that's what the core looks like. So that is the sub-ice core. This is Lyle B. Hansen, the head driller and engineer. This is Chet Langway, who was the geoscientist who really made a lot of this work happen. And they're in a cold facility at Krell staring at this sub-ice core. This is the bottom of the core. This is a section we interpret as a dimicton or a basal till, and you can see some of the rocks cropping out on there. This is one of a few photographs of the intact core. In 2021, after doing some initial analyses that I'll show you, the US National Science Foundation funded a very large group of us to do the analysis of this entire core. And that was an international team, represents more than 20 institutions. We're now over 40 scientists, 7 graduate students, 5 countries. It's been an amazing project to work with such a talented group of people. If you're interested in learning more about it, the website that we maintain is very simple. It's campcentury.org. And you can read about the different labs and the people involved, the organizations. There are a lot of photographs on here and things of interest for more public dissemination. But at this point, especially with what's going on in the United States, this is a really big shout out to the National Science Foundation for supporting the research you're going to see today. Okay, so I'm going to go base this talk on a couple different things. The first is a book that I had come out with W. Norton last summer called When the Ice is Gone. And the history that you're going to hear today is based on the research I did for that book. The science I'm going to talk about is based on a series of papers. The first two by Drew Christ, who was a postdoc with us in the lab. And his first paper is in the Proceedings of the National Academy. That's this one. And his second paper was in Science, defining the loss of Camp Century at MIS 11, 400,000 years ago. This is the third paper that, although I am first author, really is Drew's. After he left his postdoc, I pushed this through the final editorial work, but it really should be a Christ paper. And then this is one by Catherine Collins, who was a master's student by us that's currently in review. It's gone through the first set of revisions and it's back out with reviewers, and Climate of the Past in EGU. So the data that I talk about today, you should be able to find in any one of these five sources. All right, so let's go with the history first. I'm just going to do a bit of history for people who might not be familiar with Camp Century. The US interest in Greenland starts in World War II, and our interest was in getting airplanes to the Allies. And in 1940, 1941, we built two bases in Greenland. And the purpose of those was to fly airplanes from Maine to Goose Bay and Labrador, to Greenland, to Iceland, to Scotland, and then to the European theater. The reason that we needed to do this is that German U-boats occupied the North Atlantic, so you didn't want to put 20 or 30 or 40 airplanes on one cargo ship and fear losing them. And you couldn't, for most planes, fly the direct route from Gander to Prestwick because they didn't have enough fuel capacity. So some of the long-range bombers could do that, but the fighter planes needed to do these short hops. And so the U.S. got very interested in Greenland at that point. The problem is many of the planes would fall out of the sky, and when they fell out of the sky, they were luckier to land on the ice sheet, perhaps, than in the ocean at that point. And the U.S. set up a number of bases, many of which were directed toward helping rescue. We were also interested in Greenland because so were the Nazis. The Nazis maintained weather stations and something called the Weather War on East Greenland. We maintained weather stations on West Greenland. Of course, this was useful for forecasting in Europe. And it was the Coast Guard who found the Nazi weather stations on East Greenland and captured the weathermen in what's called the easternmost battle of World War II. And that's a photograph from that. But what really came out of this is the U.S. learned that operating in the Arctic, and especially moving men and materials in the Arctic, was really tricky, and that we were not well equipped. This is a soldier collecting a mail drop on skis at a remote U.S. base in Greenland. And so after the war, the U.S. military founded the Snow, Ice, and Permafrost Research Establishment outside of Chicago. This was U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this man, Henri Bader, a glaciologist, actually a crystallographer by training, who became a glaciologist with a focus on the mechanics of ice, led the research teams here and was very interested in practical applications of basic science. Or I could flip that around and say was an amazing politician who got the Army to pay a lot of money to do basic science to solve the problems they needed to solve on there. And a little bit on Bader here. This is actually his application for U.S. citizenship, but he was deeply involved in how we would move things on the ice, how we would station bases on the ice, and was the first person to advocate for deep ice coring. And that's actually Lyle Hansen pulling out a core in 1956 in Greenland. And the Army was very good at filming what they did. But Bader also thought about ice cap housing. And he had a number of miserable expeditions to Greenland and realized that there probably were better ways to work on and in the ice. And so the first thing was 1953, the Army actually started building bases inside the ice sheet. And this is one built of metal, a place called Site 1. On the ice, 16 men lived there. Ostensibly, it was a weather station. It was heated by diesel generators. And they lived underneath the ice, which turned out to be a whole lot better than living on top of the ice sheet in the middle of winter. This was very much driven by politics. So the idea of the Cold War, the Red Scare, the Russians, the East Germans potentially coming over the top, and hysteria of what should happen if Russia would win. This is an American woman being crushed by a Russian soldier's boots. It's really ironic to watch our country's turn in the last 6 weeks after spending a lot of time studying the Cold War. Um, these were only so secret. In fact, they showed up in magazines like this. This is Real, the exciting magazine for men, with a headline that says, "Our military miracle in the Arctic, our secret base under the polar ice," which goes on for many pages and shows you all sorts of pictures, but doesn't tell you where the base is and just claims it's a weather station. But if you look closely, this is 1955. If you look closely, these are militarily supplied bases, of course. And this is the artist's rendition of what they look like. But they all had radomes. There were two of these built identically, and those radomes housed radar, and that radar was looking for Soviet missiles coming over the top. Bader also was the one who started drilling, and the first drilling was in Alaska in 1950. It was on a very wet glacier, and it was done in the summer, and it was in the ablation zone. Um, and they sort of didn't know better, but this is a 16 millimeter film of the first US ice core. It's about 2 inches wide. Um, and ironically, Bader was there for drilling this, but so was this person, which is a man named Jerry Wasserberg, who went on to date moon rocks. But Wasserberg's first geoscience activity was looking at the crystalline structure of ice in 1950. Bader did then move to Greenland in the next short video clip I'll show you.
Drilling in the permafrost provides valuable information about the nature of the terrain, so drilling deep into glacial ice reveals many rewarding facts.
So that video I showed you was drilling using a standard rock drilling rig at a place called Site 2, which was in about 200 miles from the edge of the ice sheet. And they got down 1,300 feet. And they had very poor recovery. They didn't get to the bottom, but they determined that you actually could drill ice. About a year and a half ago, I got an email back from the National Archives. They had been closed during COVID, and it included a 14-minute piece of Bader and Bader's voice on a Voice of America program. I'm just going to play a little bit of that for you. But it's Bader describing why drilling ice sheets is going to be useful. So I'll just let you take a listen. It's only about 10 seconds long. And hopefully everybody can hear it.
The purpose of deep ice coring is to get information on conditions deep down in the glacier. And since conditions are simplest on the high ice caps, this is where we have been drilling.
Bader actually thought about what was at the bottom. And he speculated in a paper about whether they would hit explosive pockets of gas that had accumulated under the ice, whether there was water under pressure. He didn't know, but he would find out. So let's go to Camp Century, where this core was drilled. It too was not secret. This is a cover of Popular Science in 1960. It was excavated by these large plows that were used in the Alps. It's no accident that Bader was a Swiss man and knew about these plows. They would cut trenches 30 to 40 feet deep, and then they would roof over them. This is one of those plows cutting one trench and blowing the snow over another trench. They would put metal forms on them and blow the snow. The snow would then sinter and harden over the next couple of weeks. They'd pull the forms out, and they would have a trench inside the ice sheet. Inside those trenches, they would build heated, insulated bunk rooms and science labs. This is National Geographic photo from the time, 1960, when this is all being built. They had a full galley. They had 200 men under the ice, and they had unlimited frozen food. So the men would come home complaining about too many steaks and too many turkeys. And of course, they had latrines. And they had a waste issue to deal with. So they used a steam drill, started a well, and then they put warm sewage into it. And we left behind millions of gallons of sewage from 200 men over 6 years up there. So we left a bit of an environmental legacy inside the ice sheet. This is a map of the camp. The lengthwise here is about 1,000 feet up what they called Main Street, but we're going to focus here. This is the research and development trench. This is where the drilling happened. Of course, there were gyms and quarters and storage. There was also a nuclear power plant that powered this. Out of a French magazine for young adults is a wonderful sketch at the time. So again, the US wasn't keeping the secret. This was quite strategic. And science was a big part of this. And polar science was a big part of this. And a lot of US pride over the polar science that was being done there. Give you a quick glimpse before we dive into the data here. This is US Army newsreel at the time. And it shows you what the inside of this place would have looked like as a GI. And because of the nuclear reactor, you're in one of the coldest places in the world, but you have unlimited hot showers. And you can brush your teeth. And you have a sink that looks just like the one in our house here in Burlington, Vermont. Um, and eventually you'll see this guy using his electric razor. Again, all inside an ice sheet. So kind of a miracle of technology thing, to which we'll flip to the science, because the real miracle of Camp Century was that they, for the first time ever, got through an ice sheet and they got to the bottom. And it's the bottom we're going to focus on. So there's that same picture. That's the sub-ice core. This is a trip I took to Copenhagen in April 2019. And there, the Danes had found this core material. It had been cut up in 1972 in the US, put in these, what we call cookie jars, labeled in a code that we didn't understand at that point, and then put in these freezer boxes and had been moved around Copenhagen freezers for more than 20 years before it was refound when they brought all of their materials into one central freezer. And that's Jorg Schaefer and I. Jorg has been doing some of the beryllium and aluminum work on this core, as well as the chlorine and neon. And I was totally underdressed for a minus 27 Celsius freezer in April, like that, but absolutely fascinated. I had no idea these materials still existed. These are three of the graduate students who you're going to see data from today. They're all were master students at the University of Vermont. That's Kat on the left and Hallie in the middle and Juliana on the right. And that is an original box from Buffalo that held this core when it was in the US. Within a couple months of being in Copenhagen, the Danes graciously gave us 2 samples as test samples that were cut from the core. You could hold this in the palm of your hand, several hundred grams, and we split that about a dozen ways between different laboratories. To do that splitting, of course, we had to melt the material. And when we melted it, we wanted to save every gram, so we sieved it, and then we rinsed it. And this is the first rinsing of the first sample, and there's a little Buchner funnel there with a filter paper. And if you look closely, you'll see little black flecks floating on the top of that bin. And I took a look at that and looked at the 2 people working there with me, and having done a lot of lake coring in my early years, looked at them and said, fossils. And they looked at me and said things I won't repeat in a lecture about how crazy I was using a number of expletives. So there's the Buchner funnel. And the green arrows are going to point to all the things that at the time I thought were fossils. And I handed that material over to Drew. This is Drew Christ here. And he popped it under the microscope. Another string of expletives came out, and those indeed were fossils. And that's what got us started on thinking about the landscapes under the ice. So after those 2 initial samples, the National Science Foundation did fund us, and Drew went back to Copenhagen and worked with the Danes, as well as some French and Belgian scientists, for about a month and cut 28 samples from the core. This is an example of one of those samples. This is in what we interpret as the till, the basal till here, and had a very specific cutting strategy, much of which was done in the dark so that we could do luminescence dating, and all in a minus 20 freezer. Brought those samples back to the United States, middle of COVID, doing all this, and we did some initial paleomag and other things. I'll just quickly show you a video of the cutting here so you get an idea of what it looks like. This is the Danish freezer where the ice cores are stored, and this is a wire saw. And Drew is going to be cutting that piece, and of course the lights are going off now because we want to make sure that the luminescence signal is not zeroed. So just painstaking work for nearly a month in a freezer. So at this point, I think I really have to say thanks to 2 men who are responsible for keeping these cores frozen. And the first is Chet Langway down at the bottom. That's a picture of him in the Buffalo freezers. And the second is JP Stevenson in Denmark. JP runs their ice core storage facility, and these cores were nearly pristine after half a century. And without these 2 and their curation, we wouldn't have the science to talk about. Picture on the left is the ice core photographed before 1972, before it was cut into pieces. These are 3D models that Drew made in 2021. And there are several missing sections, very few. This one's missing, this one's missing. Several have been thawed on here and refrozen, but most of the core is exactly intact. So the first work we did, the pilot samples, we had samples from the top and the bottom. Those are the fossils under the microscope taken with an iPhone from that Buchner funnel I showed you in that filter paper. And none of us are botanists, and we looked down this and said, boy, that looks like a twig, and these look like some mosses. And that was the beginning. Um, and this is the first data that we got. And they guided our thinking on landscapes ever since. So this was our first stratigraphy. It's partially right and partially wrong. Now that we've done a lot of work, we know this is a glacial till at the bottom. We call this a dimicton at the top. It's not. It's fluvial material. It's well bedded and well stratified. And there's a layer of ice in the middle of these. And remember, to start, we had a sample at the bottom and we had a sample at the top. And we did our beryllium and aluminum measurements, and those were quite illustrative to us. We put the material under an SEM, and the low sample is in red, the upper sample is in blue. And even if you don't know anything about SEM analysis, you can look under that and say, those look really different. The lower one has a strong signal of petagenesis, of soil formation, all these grain coatings that you can see. The upper one, the grains are clean. We looked at the pore water when we melted the ice, and the red is the pore water from the lower unit down here. The blue was the pore water from the upper unit. The pore water in the lower unit is loaded with dissolved materials, dissolved cations and dissolved anions. The upper one is not. So we're seeing that we had at least two different landscape histories reflected in here. We could, at that point, start to put some numbers on them. So from the beryllium aluminum work, and I'm not going to go into depth on this, but this is what's called a two isotope diagram. We can infer time of burial. And for the lower unit, we can infer that this was buried no more than 3 million years because of its very low beryllium and aluminum ratio. The upper unit, oops, sorry about that, the wrong button. The upper unit was buried no more than 1 million years. So now we knew that there was some really young material at Camp Century at the top, but we didn't know exactly when it was buried. We just had this upper limit on burial. And that sent us down another path to work with Tammy Rittenauer at the University of Utah, who runs a luminescence lab. And this is the structuring I told you about, the cutting in particular. So we cut these samples in such a way, and you can see the sample rotating in here, that the luminescent sample came from the center, where it could not have been exposed to light, even though the core was exposed to light. And all this cutting was done in the dark. So that Tammy had, along with her student Hawk, who's pictured here, had pristine samples that we knew had not been re-exposed after the core was brought up. And these are their data, which are absolutely stunning. This is, we've known about the upper age now for a couple years. That's 416,000. That was one of the pilot samples. But Hawk's work has given us, along with Tammy's work, these next 4 ages. Down through the core, as well as 2 limiting ages down at the bottom. So this is a good time to explain what we think the stratigraphy here is that we're going to use to interpret the landscape. And if we start from the bottom, this is the glacial dimic, the till, and we know from the luminescence that it is not seen sunlight for at least 1.8 million years. Above that is this ice layer with sediment inclusions. That we call Unit 2. Unit 3 is a slump that looks very much both geochemically and physically like the till, and we interpret that as probably a flow till or permafrost-induced slump or mass movement. And then Unit 4 and 5 are both fluvial, they're stratified. 4 is finer grain, 5 is coarser grain. But the takeaway from this is everything from above the till has luminescence ages of 400,000 years that are indistinguishable. And that is MIS 11, marine isotope stage 11, a time known to be warm, a time where we know that Greenland's ice sheet receded. So really, we have a tale of 2 landscapes here. We have a glacial landscape at the bottom, and we have an interglacial landscape at the top. So this is a great time-lapse video that Drew did of taking apart these samples. We would melt them. We did this in a laminar flow hood. We would collect the sediment, we would centrifuge it, and we would get the pore water out of it. And we would use that pore water, and it took a better part of a day to do a single sample completely like this. We would use that pore water for analysis. And this is Juliana's work. She's diluting some of these pore water aliquots. And the pore water told us a lot. So these are the major cations in these samples by depth. We don't have any for Unit 4. We have Unit 5, Unit 3, Unit 2, and Unit 1. Let's focus on Unit 1. The dominant cation in here is calcium, followed by magnesium, then sodium, then some potassium. And if you compare Unit 1 to all the other units, it's greatly enriched in these major cations. That's consistent with a long residence time of the pore water in the soil and extensive soil weathering. Unit 2, mostly ice, has very low cation abundance, and Units 3 and 5 have similar but far lower than Unit 1, indicating a low residence time for the pore water in those units. Kat Collins, another master student, worked with micro CT as one of her tools. This was down at Krell, and hopefully I can show you the video of her work while we talk about this. So these are the scans in the CT put together. This is as though you had a CT scan, except we're doing it to the cores before they were melted, which preserves an archive of what was in there, but also allows us to do detailed stratigraphic analysis. And we're starting from the top down here. You can see those sandy units. This is Unit 5 and Unit 4. You can see some stratigraphy in there. You can see fractures in the core. And we have then, this is Nico Perdrial's work, who's another collaborator on this project at the University of Vermont. And Nico has looked by unit at some of the structures we see, and the video is going to keep playing, so we'll get down further in the core as it plays. But up top, we can see ice lenses, so we know that this was a permafrost environment at some point. We can see ice filling fractures in Unit 2. We can see air bubbles in Unit 2. In Unit 3, which is what we interpret as the flow-till, we can see the large class in here, the cobbles, we can see the matrix. And again, up here in Unit 5, we can see some really excellent bedding. I realize I'm going backwards compared to the video. The video's down in some of the till-like material here. And we can see some discontinuities. We can see gaps in time in here. So this, for instance, is Unit 2 at the bottom, the icy layer, and this is that flow-till on top of it with a large class. So the CT scans have become really invaluable in understanding how these landscapes worked. And it's stuff that you never would have seen if you hadn't scanned these in 3 dimensions. And there again is that basal till, which looks awfully like till you might find in an outcrop. Kat also looked very closely using the SEM at the grain coatings on here. And so if we look down at Unit 1, here's the photomicrograph of Unit 1, and the grains are all covered in grain coatings. And Unit 2 has many of those grain coatings, but they've been sort of knocked off the grains in many places. They're just these aggregates. Unit 3, which has debris flow, looks the same, but you get up to the top and you see Unit 4 and Unit 5, and there's very little in the way of grain coatings. And she quantified that by looking at all these images and counting. And again, the upper units have little to no grain coatings. The lower unit has extensive grain coatings. We can replicate this with geochemical measurements of leaching these coatings off. So we're pointing to the early material, this first unit, as having extensive soil development. And then we can look at what's my expertise in here, and that's the beryllium-10. And this is the in situ beryllium-10. We did replicates by grain size. We measured every sample for which we could generate enough quartz. The beryllium-10 are in this column. This is 0 atoms per gram. This is 8 times 10 to the 4th, so 80,000 atoms per gram. This is our stratigraphy, and again, Unit 1, Unit 2, 3, 4, and 5 on here. This is grain size in color. And the last column is sediment and ice by mass. So if we start at the bottom and come up, Unit 1 is homogeneous for beryllium-10, and that tells us a lot. That tells us that this unit was not exposed at the surface to cosmic radiation, or we would see an increase in the beryllium-10 concentration as we got toward the top. So if there one time was a top to this unit, it's gone now. But we know from the geochemistry that this till is weathered and there was a soil developed in it. We know that petagenesis, we know the grain coatings. So we have something that was out. It has fossils in it. It was presumably much warmer than today. We have isotopic reasons with stable isotopes to think that. And it was a weathered environment. If we then move up to that flow till, or that mass movement, it looks in beryllium exactly like the stuff below, which is its source. And much of the mineralogy and the high temperature isotopic geochem suggest exactly the same, that this material was derived from here. But as we keep going up into the fluvial material, it gets a little more interesting. So there's about a 60,000 atom per gram difference in the fluvial material up here and the lower material from which it's derived. To do that at the surface, you need 10 to 15,000 years of exposure at a production rate of 4 to 5 atoms per gram per year. So that implies that there was a significant period of time in which the ice was gone and this landscape was exposed to cosmic radiation. But it gets even more interesting as we go up because we can see a declining profile in here, which indicates stability. So the Unit 3, Unit 4 combination here into the bottom of Unit 5 had to be stable at the surface for several thousand years to get this 20,000 atom per gram increase in beryllium-10, and it makes the profile exactly as you would expect from a stable surface being exposed because the cosmic ray neutrons attenuate with depth. And then the upper part of Unit 5, homogeneous again. But it's not stirred. This is not an active zone in permafrost, or else we would have lost the stratigraphy. But the CT scans show us that this is bedded and well stratified. So that tells us that this is probably very rapid deposition. And then because there's none of this decline profile, it was rapidly buried, presumably by ice at that point. So we have yet another handle on what the landscape is doing. But the most powerful thing we have that pulls all this together is Halley's work in paleoecology. And this woman has spent the last 2 years counting thousands and thousands of fossils and identifying them along with Dorothy Petit at Lamont and Ola Benecke in Copenhagen. And I'm just going to show you a slide that she gave me from Unit 5. And that's a picture of her at the microscope doing her identifications. And what she's done here, which I really love, is she's shown you the fossil. And this is an Arctic poppy. And then she's shown you what it looks like in the flesh if you're out there in the field. And another fossil and the flower. And a sedge seed and the sedge. So this lets you visualize from these tiny fossils, these are millimeter scale, sub-millimeter scale fossils, what a landscape might have looked like. And then because she has characterized all these, she's identified the taxa, and working with Dorothy and Ola knows the ecological niches that those taxa fill. She can start interpreting the landscape that must have been there and the mosaic of landscape features. We've also applied stable isotopes to this. This is with Eric Steig, and Halley's done a lot of the interpretation. The story is actually pretty simple. However you pre-treat these and whatever units we're in, most of them represent some mixture between C3 land plants and lacustrine or fluvial algae. So some are the end members over in the algae side, standing water, and some are terrestrial land plants. And most of the fossil mixtures that we've analyzed with stable isotopes and carbon nitrogen fall somewhere in between. So we're getting a feeling from her work that this is a varied landscape with lots of different things going on. And this is a table that Halley just put together about a week ago, so it's pretty raw, but let me run you through our interpretation, our initial interpretation of it. So for each of these units, and I need your forgiveness for the fact that this is stacked upside down, and Halley and I will be working on that. Unit 1 should be at the bottom, not at the top here. What she did was identify the taxa, and then talk about the sort of plant or animal types that they represent, and then the habitat characteristics that they live in. And that gets us back to geomorphology, right? So that the physical habitat that these things live in is the landscape. And then mean July temperature estimates for these. So the lower two units, 1 and 2, represent mean July temperatures between 1 and 10 degrees C, and the upper units are warmer. They're 5 to 10 degrees C on there. What I did was pretty simple. I went through and I identified characteristics and I color-coded them. So for all 5 of these units, there's a mix of sheltered and open terrain on here. So that's the topography. For all of these units, there's disturbed or mineral soil. So this is an area of great disturbance. And for any of you who've been in the Arctic, that totally makes sense when you're up at this latitude. All of these represent snow covering and late snow patches. That, again, completely makes sense where the summer is really short there. And all of these reflect permafrost. Again, 77 degrees north makes sense. Most of them reflect shallow lakes, ponds, and pools. And so the stable isotopes, the mixture between lacustrine and algae, makes sense. We don't find this in Unit 2 here. And then again, most of them have wetlands represented. So at the same time they have wetlands, they have well-drained areas represented. So again, it's this landscape mosaic of what's going on underneath the ice. The orange ones are the ones that are interesting to me. Those are the ones that don't show up everywhere and tell us that these different units are potentially sampling different parts of the landscape. So, for instance, Unit 2 has taxa that represent well-drained parts of the landscape, and we don't see that elsewhere on here. We just see that in the Unit 2. And Unit 3 and Unit 4 have plants that need calcium-rich substrates, but yet we don't see that in some of the other units. But Unit 5 is the one that's actually got the most standouts in here. It's got plants that like acidic conditions, plants that like nutrient poor conditions, plants that like rocky outcrops, plants that like exposed slopes and muddy shorelines. And so it appears that Unit 5 is sampling a more diverse portion of the landscape here than some of the other units. So we can summarize that by saying that all 5 of these units indicate a really geomorphically diverse landscape. And I think Hallie was referring to this as an ecoshed, right? So we think about watersheds, and they contribute the water to what we might measure in runoff. But this is an ecoshed where these fossils are being contributed by a certain area upstream if this is moving water, or up ice if this is till. And all of these ecosheds have places disturbed by surface processes. They're all dominated by permafrost and snow. They all have this mix of open and sheltered areas. And all but Unit 2 are wet. Unit 1 seems like it's the least diverse in some ways, or Unit 2 is the least diverse. Sorry, that's a typo. That should be Unit 2. And Unit 5 has the most unique landscape features on here. And the question we're asking ourselves now, is this a preservation bias, or is this real from all of these? And I can't answer that, but I think it's a different way of looking at this landscape. All right, and here's just a picture, the Russell Glacier outside of Kanger, and I look at all this and I look at that picture and I go, okay, I see snow, I see mineral soil, I see disturbed, I see areas that are more open and areas that are more sheltered on there, and areas that are clearly richer in soils and areas that are mineral soil. So this helps me sort of envision what this landscape might have looked like at MIS 11. So here's another way I'm going to try to put this together before I finish, which is to borrow a diagram from Kat Collins's paper. And this one correctly has Unit 1 at the bottom and Unit 5 at the top. And these are Drew's diagrams that Kat modified of what the landscape might have looked like at different times. And so Unit 1, again, we have this time constraint greater than 1.8 million from the luminescence, less than 3.2 from the cosmogenics. Everybody else is 400,000 years ago. What do the CT scans tell us? They tell us that the bottom is an eroded till plain. Unit 2 could be a snowbank. It could be basal ice. We can't pin that down yet. Unit 3 is a mass movement of till. Then the top 2 are floodplains, different energy. Beryllium tells us that till plain is eroded and it hasn't been exposed near the surface, or what was exposed is eroded. Unit 3 seems to be a mixture from the beryllium 10 of the lower and upper units. Unit 4 was stable for thousands of years, and Unit 5 represents rapid fluvial deposition. The fossils tell us that Unit 5 has this greatest variety of landscapes represented on there. Unit 2 has the least variety. Everybody else has a matrix of different kinds of landscapes. The pore water tells us that till plain must have been out for a long time because it's so enriched in these dissolved materials. Whereas the upper units have minimal grain weathering because the pore water contains very low quantities of dissolved solids. And that lower unit has a well-developed soil on it, and the upper units do not have well-developed soils. So we're trying to figure out what this landscape under the ice might have looked like using 5 inches of core. That's 3 meters long. All right, I just want to finish by going to GISP 2, because I want to make the argument that this wasn't a unique place. and that if we drill through ice sheets, we are going to find fossil landscapes and fossil ecosystems. So GISP-2 was drilled in 1993. It's right smack in the center of the ice sheet there, and that was the intent. A little bit of video footage from Mark Twickler, who sent this to me. Very different technology. They're using a different drilling fluid. They're actually wearing personal protective gear. The drilling fluid for Camp Century was diesel fuel with perchloroethylene in it, dry cleaning fluid. So they got to the bottom and they drilled 1.55 meters of sub-ice material that included erratic boulders, 8 centimeters of till, and then some rock underneath. Some people will call that bedrock. I lean into it's rock. And could it be a big erratic? Maybe. Could it be bedrock? Sure. Don't know. This is what the core looks like. It's only inch-wide core. It's a very small core. And we studied the till over the last couple of years. Jörg Schaefer and others did the measurements in the rock and concluded that it must have been exposed within the last million years at the center of the ice sheet. That's the till. Those are centimeter marks. Pretty unimpressive little thing you could put in your hand, an inch wide, 8 centimeters long. That's the till on the other side when you flip it over and take a picture. And Hallie did her same magic on this. This is Arctic willow. These are spores. This is a poppy again. And the interpretation from this ecosystem at the center of Greenland was a hard, rocky landscape like this, something like what you might look like here. So now we have 2 small places on the ice where we have an idea of what the ecosystem looked like, and from the geochemistry and the ecosystem, what the landscape looked like. And that's the PNAS paper from last summer that this came out in. Okay, so why does all this matter? Well, we know the Camp Century didn't have ice at MIS 11. We know that the center of Greenland lost its ice sometime in the last 1.1 million years. We don't know if that's an older interglacial or if that's MIS 11. MIS 11 is pointed to by many people as an imperfect analog for the future, but an analog nonetheless. And the plants and the dates we have show, along with much other data, that MIS warming was long-lived and it melted away Greenland's ice. And unless we change our course right now, this is a model of Jessica Tierney's, we are headed for a very long warming with very high CO2, which is going to imply that Greenland's ice is going to melt again. And by drilling through the ice, we as scientists can get a really good idea of what replaced the ice when it was gone. And the model, the worst case model here is the RCP 8.5. And that implies that our return to 350 ppm is going to take hundreds of thousands of years. If we take a more moderate path, like the RCP 4.5 emission scenarios, then we're looking at 30,000 years of warmth. And that's about the length of MIS 11. So both of those cases will take away the Greenland ice sheet and leave us with a landscape there that we really know little about right now. The real effects of understanding Greenland, though, are understanding sea level and coastal geomorphology in that sense. This is Andrew Dunton's diagram. She thinks, and much of the data support, sea level rise of meters at MIS 5E and of meters plus at MIS 11. She would call it 6 to 13 meters. At temperatures about the same as we are today, above pre-industrial, but CO2 levels that are only on the order of 300 ppm. And right now we're over 420. So we are driving the Earth much more to the sort of Pliocene view of the world with CO2 well over 400, global temperatures headed to 2 to 3 degrees. And at that point, sea levels that could be as high as 30 to 40 meters above where we are today. So again, I would argue that understanding how Greenland's behaved in the past, understanding these paleo landscapes is going to be really critical for understanding when the ice was gone and how much of it was gone into the future. And so for half a century, we've looked to ice cores as a record of climate, of volcanism, of emissions, things like lead, going back millennia. And so our traditional view of ice cores is this: let's core the ice. But I would argue, given the data that we and the team that I work on and work with has created, is now it's possible to look under the ice and to learn about ancient landscapes from when the ice wasn't there. And that takes us far, far back in time beyond what the ice on Greenland can show us. So we can now go back in this one core to landscapes that are millions of years old as opposed to ice that by the time you get to 100,000, you've pretty much run out of ice on there. All right, so that's all I have for you, except a couple resources. Thecampcentury.org if you want to learn more about our research, and then if you want to learn more about our lab, uvm.edu Cosmolab, and then if you want to learn more about me, that's my website there. And I'm going to stop sharing and take any questions.
That was fantastic, Paul. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm sure. So people are still thinking about the questions they might want to ask you. So we still have a pretty solid audience here. So I'm sure you're going to get a few questions. So for now, while people are thinking about it, I kind of want to ask you, like way at the beginning of your talk, you were showing this aluminum beryllium diagram over time with some of the cores around Greenland, and it kind of gave me the impression that was some ups and downs over time, and but not in all of them. And so, can you talk a little bit about what that shows? Is that some kind of cyclicity, and in terms of the sensitivity that the ice sheet may have, to changes in climate on the one side versus the other, north and south, so on?
Can you see it now? I popped it up.
Yes. Yep.
Let me
That's
see
the
if I can
one.
get it. Yeah. So I wish we could explain this. Let me see if I can get it to, yeah, get that one there. We don't see a coherence in these variations, and we don't know how to interpret them. And I think that's the problem of working in the Marine Corps, right? So you get this amalgamation of ice rafted debris, and Jeremy on the left here has shown the various currents. So like 987 is fed by icebergs coming off all of northeast Greenland here. 918 is actually on that same iceberg trajectory. We don't so much have to worry. There's some icebergs coming from Europe over here, but not so much. And we don't have to worry about Iceland because it's all basalt on there, so it's not producing quartz. 645 and 1307 see this return current coming up to the north here. So it's hard to know exactly what the ice sheds were that were depositing this material. The other issue that we run into with this is this only reflects areas in Greenland where the erosion is actually active, right? The cold-based ice that's not moving quickly and is not incorporating much sediment from the bed is underrepresented in here. So there's a bias to these records compared to what you would get if you went and say sampled 100 places around the ice a million years ago. But it's all we've got. So as I say, there is, and you can look at the diagram yourself, there is very little coherence in many of these records. It does seem that that there are several that sort of in that 500,000 year time frame appear to rise in the aluminum 26 beryllium 10 on there. I think part of the uncertainty in these records comes from the dating of the cores. And as you get back in time, any error in that dating is magnified in the decay correction because you've got a million and a half year half-life for 1.4 million year half-life for beryllium 10 and 700,000 for aluminum. So once you're out several half-lives, the uncertainty on those ages grows, those decay corrected ages. So I wish I could give you a better answer. There is structure in these data. What that means, that's why this is in prep. But I think what Jeremy and I have focused on this is when you look at that decay corrected graph and you look at the production ratio, with the exception of 918, all of these are in a zone that requires significant burial on there. And Jeremy's done the modeling on this, if you expose all of Greenland for a few tens of thousands of years, the concentrations are so low. The concentrations in these last couple million years are on the order of a few tens of thousands of atoms per gram. So it doesn't take long at the surface to build back and to bring that ratio way up. The questions to me about this, and people should be thinking about this in the audience, are how does the sediment get from Greenland offshore, right? So it's carried in icebergs, but what's the time it takes for rock that's eroded here to be transported to the coast to end up in a fjord? Does it spend an interglacial in a fjord before the next glacial happens and takes it offshore? So I think there's a a lag time in the system that we don't yet well understand. And especially if the bed goes from frozen to the bed to thawed bed, how much are you storing until below the ice? And I mean, these are all really interesting and really difficult to answer questions.
Hmm.
So we have a proxy here for which it remains uncertain exactly what that proxy means.
That's fascinating. So we're starting to get some questions here. I'll read the first one. I'll let Yue take it away for the second one. So the first one comes from Mike Benedetti. Are you looking at any other ice cores that have reached bedrock in grip or Antarctic cores?
So in Greenland, there are only two deep cores that have reached bedrock, and that's GISP-2. And we looked at the till, and Jorg and his colleagues looked at the rock. So there's not much else to look at in GISP-2. And in 2014, we looked at the basal ice there. At Camp Century, we've worked on the sub-ice materials, and the Danes are leading a project to look at the basal ice there. And Jorg and Jason have the green drill cores from northern Greenland, and that's it. Die 3 did not bring up basal materials, and it's warm based. And the grip cores have small amounts of basal materials in them, but mostly the basal ice. So, people ask me all the time, what's the next thing to do in Greenland? And I suspect I will not be in science long enough and probably won't live long enough, at least on the current trajectory in the United States, to see a deep ice core drilled in Greenland that gets to the bottom. But I think the most fascinating thing we could do is we've sampled a lot of ice in Greenland, and sure, there are arguments to sample more ice, but I think the big payoff will be getting through that ice, getting to the bed in multiple places, and bringing up the bed materials. And if we could have a deep drilling rapid access system that's not limited to working on the margins, but can get to the center and get down and get that material and bring it back up, we can learn a huge amount about what's going on in Greenland. I am not an Antarctic expert, so I'm going to defer on the Antarctic side. Jeremy and I did work on the Andril core there. We did the analysis work. He did the thinking work on that one.
Okay, great. So there's a question from Jason in the chat. He said, "Hi, Paul, great talk. Just curious what impact the use of drilling fluid may have had on any of the stable isotope signals."
Really good question. I don't think Eric Steig is online. He's actually visiting me now, but I think he's got another meeting at this point. They did have some issues with the drilling fluid measuring the water stable isotopes on there, which they resolved. The drilling fluid, as I said, was a mix of organic chemicals, and we don't have any of the drilling fluid. We do have the cutting fluid that was used in Denmark, and so we knew what was in there. The drilling fluid seems to not have had a big effect on the stable isotopes, and what effect was there we could detect. The bigger problem with the drilling fluid, and I didn't show you these data, are the anions. There's a huge amount of formate, which turns out to be a degradation product of, I believe, the glycol they used to melt the chips in the hole. So they used a drilling fluid of perchloroethylene and Arctic diesel fuel, but then the drill they had, which was electromechanical drill, so that the drill was very heavy, and it had a motor in it, and they fed power to it, and they used that to drill, but they had to get rid of the chips. And the way they got rid of the chips was a glycol solution to melt the chips and then pump the water out. And that glycol apparently has these degradation products. So we see huge formate peaks that there's no reason those should be in ice. And that anion data are much more suspect because of that. And that, I mean, when we got these two test samples and Drew and I opened the DHL box right next to our freezer, looked at the bag and then just had to open one. We had our gloves on and we opened the bag and we almost retched from the smell of diesel fuel. And that was 1966, and we're holding cores in 2019. And then we immediately went and did all the rest of our work in fume hoods because they stunk so badly. So there's a lot of drilling fluid left in these, and yeah, it's not a problem for the cosmogenic work. It does not appear to be a problem for the stable isotope work. But again, by the time those fossils get to the stable isotope and the CN work, we've removed the matrix, they've been washed, and we're isolating them. So we've probably removed most of that drilling fluid at that point.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think, well, we don't have any other questions here, but this has been phenomenal. And we're already at noon 07, it seems like, on New York time. So I just want to thank you again, Paul, for coming. Thank everybody else for joining today. We look forward to seeing you in the future weeks as we move on. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
Our pleasure.